Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana, right outside of Tel Aviv. It's August 25th, 2024. And today's broadcast is called This Means War, or Does It? And what I'll be trying to explain to you this evening is basically I'll try to make sense of today. It was a strange day for us here in Israel. A lot of news to try to sort through. A lot of disinformation coming out, not necessarily from our side, but just in general, that forces us to ask what is really happening here? To what extent should we take events at face value? To what extent do we need to do the old Middle East thing, which is to realize that to an extent, this is a game, and what is the game right now? Who's playing? What is each side trying to profess as we move forward? For me, the day began around 6 a.m. when I was up and I got a text from one of my kids who's living in New York right now. And she texted and asked, "Is everyone okay?" And that was strange that a family member in the US was asking us if we were okay when I had no idea what was going on. So I immediately opened up my phone and quickly scrolled through whatever news sites I normally check. And lo and behold, I got a bit of a rundown of what had happened so far that day. Before I go into the actual event itself, I want to reiterate the idea that there really are a number of Israels. I've said this before. Where I live right now in Ra'anana in central Israel, it's a bubble. And as much as I say that I speak for Israelis and what Israelis are going through, look, I got to be clear. It's only my experience. It's only what I'm perceiving and I'm experiencing here in this bubble of central Israel and even more specifically Ra'anana, which is a fairly well off town with people who have economic means and um, people who are doing all right. There are several Israels, though, and the residents of northern Israel lived a completely different experience today than those of us in the center and in the south. So that's the first thing I really want to drive home is that any one perspective you're getting is only that person's perspective. And in my case, yeah, I am in a bubble here in the center. And you must realize that there are several Israels. Even though we're a tiny country the size of New Jersey, no one can really speak for everyone. So here's what went down. At 4:45 this morning, Israel time, and I guess that would be 9:45 p.m. last night for those of you on the East Coast, Israel carried out a preemptive strike on Hezbollah rocket launchers throughout Lebanon. And the exact number isn't known, but what I'm hearing right now is that thousands of rocket launchers were attacked. And of those thousands, several hundred, probably in the neighborhood of 600, were primed and ready to strike Israel. And they were about to go off at 5 a.m. So Israeli intelligence basically picked up, they've been watching, obviously, Hezbollah nonstop, and picked up around, well, throughout the night that Hezbollah was preparing to attack all of Israel, including central Israel, including Tel Aviv, and that the attack was supposed to begin at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so 15 minutes before that, Israel began its preemptive strike against these Hezbollah rocket launchers and destroyed a few thousand of them, about 600 of whom were ready to attack Israel. And the others that were destroyed that were not going to attack Israel in this upcoming attack, it was known that they would be used at a future date. So we went ahead and took those out as well. In terms of what the targets were, what was Hezbollah intending to hit? What Israeli intelligence determined is that they were intending to hit crucial strategic targets in central Israel, including possibly power plants, the Kiryat, which is the central, like what you would call the Pentagon, the central military headquarters in Tel Aviv, but also not insignificantly, an army base called Glilot. And I say not insignificantly because this one happens to be really close to my house. Glilot is an army base in Herzliya. It doesn't look anything like an army base. It looks like a really nice office complex. So picture like the most boring and yet upscale office complex you can imagine in your suburbia. That's what the Glilot army base looks like. And I don't have a problem describing it or saying the name of the base because all of Israel's enemies knows what it is and where it is. And Glilot, among other things, is the home of Israel's intelligence units and the Mossad. The Mossad is based at Glilot, and it's in Herzliya, about 3 miles from my house, maybe not even 3 miles. I drive past it all the time, anytime I go to Tel Aviv. It's an open secret. And so this was one of the targets. So unlike past times when Hezbollah would fire at the north or the Galilee or Hamas would fire at the south, this one would have been really close to us. And who knows, any errant missiles that happened to go off course could very well have hit here in Ra'anana. And for all I know, they were targeting towns like Ra'anana, Kfar Saba as well. In any case, Israel was able to thwart this attack. So it did not go off at 5 a.m. as Hezbollah had planned. Within an hour after that, however, Hezbollah launched over 200 drones, rockets, and missiles at Israel's north. Many of them were intercepted. A number of them landed in open areas. Contrary to popular belief, Iron Dome does not intercept every missile fired at Israel. It only intercepts those that the military, in a very short amount of time, determines would hit a populated area if it were not shot down. So when a missile is fired at Israel, a calculation is done by the soldiers who work with Iron Dome, and they quickly determine whether this would actually hit an army base, an apartment complex, a school, any civilized piece of civilization or military base. And if it's determined that this missile will land just in the open, in open fields, they allow it. They allow it to simply fall. Mainly for the sake of preserving resources. Iron Dome is, and David's arrow, which is the next generation, or maybe it's David's sling, is extremely expensive. And we also have a limited number of them. So we're not going to waste them on missiles that we've determined will not do any harm to people or to military targets. So with these over 200 drones, missiles fired at Israel's north, some were intercepted, some were allowed to fall out into the open, and some did manage to get through and cause some damage and injury. From what I've heard, nothing major in terms of damage and injury, but damage and injury nonetheless. At that point, a warning was put out to all of Israel that we were going to be on high alert for the next 48 hours. This is done by Pikud HaOref, which is the Home Front Command. And unlike other units of the IDF, which are taxed with the responsibility of protecting Israel from the outside, the Home Front Command, their whole job really is exactly what their title is, the Home Front. They are the ones who pass out gas masks if there's concern about a gas or poisonous gas attack. They're the ones who take care of the citizens within Israel. During Corona, it was the Home Front Command who helped mobilized to distribute vaccines to certain areas of the population. Again, they're not dealing with the enemies, they're dealing with Israelis within Israel. Of all backgrounds, by the way, they give out vaccines to Arab populations as well. It's not just a Jewish, it's not simply a Jewish unit. So the Home Front Command issued new rules that for the next 48 hours, we Israelis had to be on high alert. That meant no gatherings of more than 30 people outdoors and no gatherings of more than 300 people indoors. Basically, this kind of thing doesn't happen that often anyway, so it really didn't change many people's plans. Maybe if there was a large ultra-Orthodox wedding with over 300 guests, they would be affected. And between you and me, I highly doubt they would follow it anyway. Why for 48 hours? Well, it turns out that 48 hours is actually the maximum amount of time that we can be put on high alert. There has to be a reassessment done within that 48-hour period. So you're never going to face a situation where the Home Front Command says for the next week or for the next 2 weeks or 10 days, we are on high alert. It's always up to 48 hours. So at this moment that I'm speaking to you, we are technically on high alert. So the question is, what was our day like being on high alert? I can tell you, for better or for worse, here in the center of the country, absolutely nothing changed. And I mean zero. You would not have known from people's behavior that we were under high alert. There was the same number of people in parks, children playing outside, riding bikes, at the skate park, playing basketball. I was over at the tennis courts this morning for my daily hit, and tennis courts were full as always. Really nothing had changed. And I had a different podcast interview this afternoon in central Israel in Ramat Gan that I went and met my subject, my source, and we did it as usual. So really here in the country, this is what I'm talking about, bubbles and different Israels. Our lives were absolutely the same, nothing different. In the north, meanwhile, they were staying near their bomb shelters the entire time. They were told they had to be near the bomb shelters because more attacks could come at any moment. And so for them, it was a completely different situation. They literally were on high alert, living touch and go moment to moment. There were fighter jets overhead all day. You know, those of you who've been to Israel know that every so often you'll hear a fighter jet with its, very rarely you'll also hear the sonic boom. I didn't hear sonic booms today, but I definitely heard fighter jets overhead. And as soon as you look up to see it, it's already gone. You need to look a few miles forward or back or in a different direction, because by the time you hear that plane overhead, it's already way past you. But throughout the day, we were hearing the loud sounds of fighter jets overhead, which I assume were on their way back or on their way to missions both in Lebanon and in Gaza as well, because throughout all this, the fighting is continuing in Gaza. Netanyahu issued a warning, our prime minister issued a warning that there could be more to come, that this is not necessarily over. And I think most bizarre of all is that both sides claimed victory. Both sides claimed to have won. It's easy to see why Israel would have claimed that we had won, because we had thwarted what looked like to be an attack on our most sensitive military targets, including, like I said, the home of the Mossad at Gililot. The fact that we were able to take out thousands of rocket launchers, including 600 that were primed to attack us within the quarter hour, that would obviously be a major success for Israel. And the U.S. was a partner in Israel in helping to determine the time of the scheduled attack of Hezbollah. From what I've heard, the U.S. did not actually participate in the taking out of these rocket launchers, but we had the United States' blessing, which I think is a good sign and good for Americans as well. What's more bizarre is that Hezbollah claimed victory as well. And it's actually kind of easy to understand why. So first of all, Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, He claimed that Israel did not even carry out a preemptive strike. He claimed that Israel did not take out any rocket launchers, and that the rockets would simply be used at a later date according to Hezbollah's determination. Nasrallah also claimed that its rockets managed to hit its targets in Israel, in Galilot, the army base I told you about, other sensitive military targets. And you can understand why he would say this. I've told you many times before on this podcast that in the Middle East, especially in the Arab world, it's all about saving face and it's all about posturing. Now, add to that the fact that his own people in Lebanon are not going to be able to check up on him. They're not going to see media that shows that Israel actually thwarted the attack. So they're just going to believe it. So whatever he says is going to be their truth. So as far as the Lebanese are concerned, this was a major victory for them, that they were able to launch all these rockets at Israel and hit our sensitive military targets. It just goes to show you how much all of this is, it's trite to use the word game because there are lives on the line and there are still hostages in Gaza. But it very much is a game, at least for our enemies, because that need to save face, that need to come across as victorious is so important that it's not just about bending the truth. It's about creating an absolute lie in order to present to their population a reality which simply does not exist. So what are Israelis saying? Well, there's a few things. Let's start with here in the center. In the center, we're saying, how close did we actually come? Were they really going to attack at 5 a.m.? Or was this just a ruse to draw us into bombing them, to destroying their rocket launchers so they wouldn't have to actually attack? Because if they actually attacked, maybe there would be retaliation from Israel and the United States that they didn't want to have happen. So maybe this was all a setup by Hezbollah so they could come across saving face and saying they were about to attack the Zionists without actually having to do it. A lot of us are asking, is this actually over now? You know, ever since we took out the general of Hezbollah, Shukr, we've known that Iran and Hezbollah wanted to retaliate. So what we are asking right now is, was that it? Is this the retaliation? Can we now sort of exhale and assume that this section of the game is over? Or is there more to come? Now, what's interesting is that in the north, residents of the north of Israel are not thinking like this at all. They're saying something else. And they're actually pretty pissed. What they're saying is that Israel, they'll say that Israel is going to preemptively strike when the center of the country is threatened, but not when the north is threatened. Because what we've seen is that over and over, the north has been bombed, people killed, property damaged, homes destroyed. And Israel has, quote unquote, allowed it to happen. There have been no preemptive strikes to prevent it happening in the north. You could say the same about the south, that for years Israel has allowed Hamas to bomb the south, but only when it threatened the center. Then does Israel get serious about retaliating or knocking out Hamas over the years. So the north has a very different narrative here than those of us in the center. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside Israel. August 25th, a big day here in Israel. And before I go on to our questions, I want to talk about this week's podcast. The one I am doing right now, this recording, this is not going to be the one that goes up on Wednesday on Apple and Spotify. Instead, I have another interview for you this week. This week, I have Susan Weiss, who is the executive director of the Center for Women's Justice. I sat down with her a couple of weeks ago to talk about women's rights here in Israel. I think it's really important that with everything going on in Israel right now, it would be so easy to only focus on Hamas, the war, Hezbollah, the hostages, displaced residents. But there's so much more in Israel that we need to know about, that we need to be talking about. And I don't want these other issues and questions to get swept under the rug. And so I'm talking to Israelis from all different backgrounds and with all different areas of expertise to contribute to the pod. And so this week, it's an interview with Susan Weiss, who, as I said, is the executive director for the Center for Women's Justice. And she is going to talk to me. I mean, she's already talked to me. And it was a fascinating interview about marriage and divorce law here in Israel, about the October 7th attacks and what it means that we still have female hostages that the rest of the world really isn't paying attention to, the sexual crimes being inflicted upon them. So, and for me, the biggest revelation of all from my interview with Susan was how Israel's marriage and divorce laws are biased not only against women, but against men as well in some very serious ways. So that podcast is going to go up on Apple and on Spotify this Wednesday. It will not be done over Zoom like these are. The only way to get it is to visit Apple or Spotify podcast platforms. I'm going to put right here in the chat the best way to see those links. Just go to my website, which is joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And that is where you can subscribe to, if you have an iPhone, the easiest way is probably just Apple Podcast, that little purple logo, and Spotify, it is on there as well, the green logo. But by subscribing there, you will always get the audio version of the Sunday night podcast broadcasts. But you'll also get the interviews, which are going to happen about once every 2 or 3 weeks. So I really encourage you to do so. All right. As for questions this week, Jonathan wrote in just today. He wrote, is it possible that Hezbollah deliberately invited a preemptive strike by Israel for their own internal propaganda/narrative purposes? Yes, Jonathan, it is. And I alluded to this before. It is completely possible that Hezbollah not only deliberately invited, but perhaps even notified the US and Israel that it was going to, quote unquote, attack at 5 a.m., knowing that we would preemptively strike. You know, what's interesting is the very, very low death count from today's preemptive strike in Lebanon. You would think that with thousands of rocket launchers taken out, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, would have been killed in the process. As far as I know, it's less than a dozen. So it does make you wonder if maybe Hezbollah did have it in their interest for us to preemptively strike so they could save face. I need a minute. I'll be right back. You know, I'm going to go ahead and break the fourth wall here and tell you, when I perform on stage, I speak for an hour and I have no problem going the entire hour. For some reason, the podcast, my voice gets dry and I can't maintain. So I got to work on that. I'm actually going to close it out here.
Thanks for joining this week. I'll see you next Sunday night.